The pregnant widow collapsed at the station. The cowboy lifted her and said, "You're safe now." The noon train had barely screamed to a stop when the pregnant widow stumbled into the center of the station platform, one hand gripping her belly, the other clutching a frayed carpet bag that looked heavier than she did. Travelers parted like she carried plague instead of child, skirts swishing away, boots shifting back, no one willing to offer more than a stare. Dust blew across the planks as the whistle died, and in that breathless quiet, her knees buckled, the carpet bag slipping from her grasp and spilling threadbare clothes across the sun-baked boards. A man snorted somewhere near the ticket booth. "Ain't nobody helping her?" he muttered, but still didn't move. The station master only adjusted his hat, pretending to read the timetable nailed to the wall. The widow's breath came jagged, like she was drowning on dry land. Her braids stuck to her cheek with sweat as she whispered, "Please, someone," before her voice wavered and she crumpled fully, collapsing onto her side with a soft cry that vanished under the hiss of cooling metal from the train's undercarriage. Her bonnet rolled away, revealing a face drained of color and a bruise blooming faintly along her temple, as if this wasn't the first fall she'd taken today. A woman with a parasol hesitated, then stepped back when the widow reached a trembling hand toward her. "Don't," the woman whispered to her husband. "Not our problem." And for a moment, the entire station froze. Men, women, drifters, cowboys, clerks, all looking away from a woman too small and too tired to even turn her face out of the sun. Then, boots moved. Heavy, sure. Slow enough to be calm, fast enough to be urgent. A shadow crossed the platform, swallowing the glare, and a cowboy knelt beside her, broad-shouldered, dust-coated, jaw set like he'd carried storms across his back. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice a deep rumble that cut through the heat. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered, unfocused, scared. I just need a minute," she whispered, trying to push herself up with trembling arms, but her elbow buckled and she gasped as pain curled through her belly. He didn't ask permission to act. He simply slid one arm beneath her shoulders, the other behind her knees, and lifted her as if she were nothing more than a bundle of dry linens, gentle but unshakably strong. Gasps rose from the onlookers. Someone muttered, "That's her. Widow from the Larson place. Husband died last winter." Another added, "Heard she can't pay the landlord. Heard he's after her papers." The cowboy ignored them all. He pressed her carefully to his chest, adjusting her so her head rested against his shoulder, making sure her belly wasn't strained, one hand braced instinctively to shield her from the sun. She clung to his shirt in a dazed, frightened grip, as if her body remembered danger, even if her mind couldn't hold the shape of it right now. "You're all right," he murmured, steady as oak. "I got you." But when she winced with a sharp breath, he shook his head, jaw tightening. "We're not staying here." Without waiting for approval from any soul on that platform, he turned toward the exit, boots thudding with purpose. Her carpet bag kicked aside by a passing man until the cowboy bent and hooked it with his heel, dragging it along with them. A voice rose behind him, sharp, irritated. "Hey, she didn't buy a ticket." Another laughed. "Let her pay later with whatever she's got left." The cowboy didn't even glance back. Holding her closer, shielding her from the crowd as if she were something sacred, he murmured the words she had needed all morning, maybe all year. "You're safe now." And with that promise hanging in the hot station air, he carried her out into the blinding daylight where her fate would finally begin to change. Heat rippled off the dusty road as the cowboy carried the fainting widow away from the station, his stride long and certain, the weight in his arms no more troublesome than carrying a child half asleep. Her breath shuddered against his collar as she tried weakly to form words, but he only murmured, "Save your strength," and kept walking until the noise of the platform faded behind them. A single wagon waited near the water trough, a plain buckboard with peeling paint, an old sorrel mare hitched to it, tail swishing lazily at flies. He laid her gently on the padded bench, propping a folded blanket beneath her head, then swung up beside her and clucked the reins. The wheels lurched into motion, rattling along the rutted path that cut through open fields toward the hills. Wind stirred the dust behind them, carrying the faint echo of a station whistle, though whether it belonged to a departing train or someone shouting after them, neither could tell. The widow blinked at the brightness, her hand drifting instinctively to her belly. "Please," she whispered, voice raw. "You don't even know me." He cast her a sideways glance, not unkind but firm. "I know enough. You collapsed alone. People stared. That's all I needed to see." She swallowed hard, tears gathering but refusing to fall. "They think I'm trouble," she whispered, fingers twisting in her skirt. "Maybe they're right." A muscle in his jaw ticked. "Folks think a lot of things, doesn't make it truth." The mare's steady rhythm filled the silence as the wagon rolled past golden fields alive with grasshoppers. The hot wind tugged at her hair, cooling the sweat on her temples. She watched the town shrink behind them, storefronts blurring into specks, the station roof disappearing first, then the water tower, then everything familiar, until only the open road remained. "You should take me back," she said suddenly, panic rising as she tried to sit up. "If Harold finds out I left—" She cut herself off, breathing sharp and unsteady. The cowboy pulled the reins just enough to slow the wagon, his gaze turning fully on her now. "Harold?" he repeated. "That the one you're running from?" Her eyes darted away, lips trembling. "Please, I shouldn't have said his name." He clicked his tongue once, urging the horse onward. "You didn't run far enough," he said quietly. "And if the man's the reason you fell back there, you don't need to see him again." She pressed a hand to her mouth, shaken by how easily he'd picked up the pieces she hadn't meant to reveal. Her breaths came shallow, the memory of boots on wooden floors, voices raised, threats whispered too close, all flickering behind her eyes. "He said I owed him rent for the winter," she murmured, each word scraped thin. "He said, since I didn't have a husband anymore, I'd pay some other way." The cowboy's expression darkened, but he kept his voice steady. "So he chased you out." "I thought if I got to the station, I could get on a train before he found me," she said, rubbing her arms as if cold despite the heat. "But I didn't make it." "You did now," he replied, "and you won't be meeting him again today." They passed a weathered sign pointing toward a creek 2 miles ahead. He steered toward it, guiding the horse down a narrower path lined with scrub and willow. "Why are we stopping?" she asked, fear flaring again. "You need water," he said simply. "Shade, and breathing that isn't filled with other people's judgment." The road curved, opening to a quiet hollow where a shallow creek sparkled over stones. He halted the wagon beneath the only cottonwood tree big enough to offer real shade. Then he turned to her, voice softer now. "You're not trouble," he said. "You're tired, and no one should be punished for trying to survive." Her breath hitched, a tear finally breaking free as the wagon settled. She whispered, barely audible, "Why are you being kind?" He looked at her as if the question itself hurt. Because no one was back there. And with that, he stepped down, came around, and reached up to help her onto the soft grass. The creek's cool murmur promising the first moment of safety she'd felt in far too long. Water glimmered across the stones in thin silver ribbons as the cowboy helped the pregnant widow down from the wagon, one steadying hand behind her back, the other guiding her arm so she wouldn't slip on the uneven ground. The cottonwood leaves whispered overhead, casting shifting speckles of shade across her face, and for a few precious breaths she closed her eyes, letting the cooler air brush away the station's heat. But peace, real peace, didn't come. Not yet. Every sound carried an echo of fear, the creak of the wagon settling, the snap of a twig in the brush, even the distant cry of a hawk high above. "Sit here," the cowboy said gently, patting a patch of grass beneath the widest limb. She lowered herself carefully, wincing as a sharp ache curled beneath her ribs. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice thin but sincere. He dipped his hat and stepped toward the creek, scooping water with his hands and splashing it over his neck before filling a tin cup from the shallows. When he brought it back to her, she hesitated. "It's clean," he said, reading her hesitation as easily as breath. "Comes straight off the ridge." She took the cup, fingers shaking, and drank. The water was cold enough to sting her throat, and for a moment she held the cup against her cheek, letting its chill soothe the throbbing beneath her temple. The cowboy leaned against the lowest branch, arms crossed loosely, studying her in a way that wasn't intrusive but felt aware. "How far along?" he asked softly. She looked down at the curve of her belly, fingertips drifting across the fabric as if trying to calculate time she had stopped counting. 7 months, she whispered. His brow lifted just a fraction. You shouldn't be traveling alone. I didn't have a choice. The rush of the creek filled the space between them. A grasshopper landed on her skirt and leapt away. Something about the quiet made her words tremble loose. People like me, she said, fiddling with the cup. We're not worth helping. He straightened. Who told you that? She shook her head, staring at her hands. My mother, Harold, the landlord's wife. Folks at church after Thomas died. They said a woman who can't keep a home together shouldn't expect kindness. A shadow crossed his face, deeper than simple anger. Something older, something like recognition. Losing your husband in a fire doesn't make you weak, he said. It makes you human. Her breath caught. How did you... Station folks talk too much, he said simply. You hear things whether you want to or not. Her throat tightened, the old shame clawing to the surface. I should have saved him, she whispered. I tried, but the smoke... She broke off, covering her eyes as the memory surged. I'm sorry, she said, her voice cracking. I don't know why I'm telling you all this. He crouched in front of her, resting one forearm across his knee, lowering himself to her level without crowding her. Because you ain't had a quiet moment to speak truth in months, he said, and because no one back there cared enough to listen. A tear fell onto the tin cup, sliding down its side. She wiped her cheek quickly, embarrassed. I'm a stranger to you, she whispered. You don't owe me anything. He tilted his head, eyes steady. Ma'am, help ain't a debt, it's a choice. Wind rippled through the cottonwood leaves, brushing cool shadows across her face. For the first time since dawn, her breathing eased, the tight band around her chest loosening just a little. But peace remained fragile, like morning frost in sunlight, as she glanced toward the trail leading back to town. Harold will come looking, she said quietly. He always does. The cowboy followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. Then he'll find empty road, he said, because when you're ready, we're moving on from here. She looked at him, really looked, and something unexpected flickered in her eyes, hope's first trembling spark. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, a distant shout echoed up the trail, faint but unmistakable. Her fingers froze around the cup. The cowboy's hand slid to the rifle resting beside the wagon wheel, and the creek, so gentle a moment ago, suddenly felt colder. The shout drifted through the cottonwood branches again, closer this time, shaped by a voice the widow knew too well, a voice that made her spine stiffen and her breath catch midair. The cowboy heard it too, his head lifted, eyes narrowing toward the trail as he shifted his weight silently, every inch of him sharpening like a blade honed on instinct. Sunlight flickered along the barrel of his rifle as he eased it up from the wagon wheel, not brandishing it, not threatening, just holding it with the ease of a man who had carried one longer than he'd carried his own regrets. Stay here, he murmured, low enough to be wind. She grabbed his sleeve, panic blooming across her face. You don't understand, she whispered, pulse fluttering wildly. If Harold finds me, if he sees you with me, he'll twist it into something it's not. He always does. The cowboy gently freed his sleeve, but placed his hand over hers for a heartbeat, grounding her. He'll see what he sees, he said. But I see something else. A woman who's been run too long. Her throat tightened, but she nodded, folding herself smaller beneath the cottonwood's shade. The cowboy stepped toward the trail, boots quiet on the grass, body angled wide enough to block her from sight. The willow shrubs trembled, then parted as a man in a sweat-soaked shirt stumbled into view. Harold, panting, red-faced and furious. His hat hung crooked over greasy hair, and one suspender dangled loose as if he'd thrown himself onto his horse and ridden without care. You! Harold snapped the moment he spotted the cowboy, pointing a trembling finger at him. That woman belongs to me. The cowboy didn't move aside, didn't even blink. A person ain't property, he said, voice steady as river rock, and she sure as hell ain't yours. Harold spat onto the dirt, fury twisting his features. She owes rent. Months of it. Winter payments. You think I don't keep record? She ran out this morning before we settled her debt. She collapsed at the station, the cowboy replied evenly. What you call debt looks a lot like harassment. Harold stiffened, eyes narrowing as he tried to peer past him. Where is she? She's hiding, isn't she? Always playing victim. The widow flinched at his words, curling into herself behind the cottonwood trunk, her hand instinctively covering her belly as if protecting the child from the hatred aimed at her. The cowboy adjusted his stance, broader now, voice dropping half an octave. You're going to turn around, he said, not loud but unyielding. You're going to ride back to town, and you're going to leave her be. Harold barked out a harsh, humorless laugh. Who do you think you are? The cowboy stepped forward once, just once, but it shifted the air like a storm cloud rolling over a prairie. A man standing between you and someone who's had enough of your cruelty. Harold's bravado faltered for a flicker, replaced by something uncertain. But then his pride surged, ugly and brittle. She signed a paper saying she owed me, he shouted. And you're harboring her, don't you see? That's a crime. If there was a paper, the cowboy said, I saw no sheriff's seal. Only a bully scribbling terms he made up. Harold's face purpled. Where is she? He demanded again, voice cracking with frustration. The widow made a small sound, barely audible, but Harold's head snapped toward it. He lunged forward to push past the cowboy. He didn't make it one step. The cowboy raised one arm, pressing a single hand against Harold's chest, not shoving, not striking, just stopping him as cleanly as a brick wall stops a thrown stone. Last chance, he said quietly. Walk away. Harold stared up into his eyes, and something in that gaze, calm, unshakable, deadly certain, made the fight drain out of him like water from a cracked bucket. This ain't over, he hissed. For her, maybe it is, the cowboy replied. And with that, Harold stumbled back, muttering curses as he turned and shoved through the brush, disappearing down the trail the same way he'd come, his anger trailing behind him like smoke. The cowboy lowered his hand, exhaling slowly. Behind him, the widow sagged forward, covering her face with both hands as silent tears spilled through her fingers. He didn't touch her yet. He simply knelt beside her and said, He won't get near you today. But even in the safety of that moment, both of them knew. Harold walking away didn't mean he was finished. Not yet. The widow barely had time to collect herself after Harold's retreat before the cowboy guided her back toward the wagon, his hand steady on her elbow, as though he expected the earth beneath her to shift again. She moved stiffly, each breath shallow, the fear Harold stirred lingering like smoke under her ribs. He'll come back, she whispered, voice trembling as she lowered herself onto the wagon bench. Harold never lets things go. The cowboy paused halfway up the step, meeting her eyes with a look that held no doubt, only certainty. Then we don't stay where he expects, he said, climbing beside her and gathering the reins. The mare snorted as if sensing tension in the air, and the wagon jerked forward, rolling up the narrow path that followed the creek into thicker willow and sage. The world seemed to tighten around them, the air heavy with the promise of something not yet past. As they traveled deeper into the brush, the widow's fingers twisted in her skirt. Why help me? She asked suddenly, voice soft, fragile. You don't even know my name. He kept his eyes on the path. Names can come later. Right now you need distance. She swallowed. It's Miriam. He nodded once quietly. Jonah. They rode in silence for a stretch, the wagon creaking beneath shifting weight, the mare picking her way carefully over tree roots and loose stones. Gradually the trail opened again, widening into a rise overlooking a long stretch of prairie. Jonah stopped the horse at the ridge, gaze scanning the horizon with the calm skill of a man who had been hunted before. Miriam followed his line of sight, and her heart lurched. Harold wasn't alone anymore. 3 riders appeared near the station road, moving fast, kicking up dust that shimmered in the heat. One pointed upward, toward them. Miriam's breath stuttered. He brought help, she whispered. He convinced them I stole from him. Jonah's jaw flexed as he flicked the reins lightly, guiding the mare along the ridge. Men who believe lies without question were looking for excuse anyway. They won't stop, Miriam said, clutching the wagon's edge as they descended the slope. Harold told them I owed him more than money. Jonah didn't need her to explain. He'd seen that look in Harold's eyes, entitlement sharpened into hunger. He drove the wagon toward a line of pines at the far end of the prairie, urging speed without frightening the mare. The wind rose around them, flinging dust into swirls that scratched their skin. Miriam pressed her hand to her belly as the wagon jolted over a rock. "Jonah," she gasped, "I can't. He'll take the child." Her words broke, choked by panic. Jonah steadied her with a hand on her shoulder, voice calm but edged with iron. "I won't let him lay a finger on you or that baby." "You don't even know us," she said through tears. He looked at her then, the smallest tilt of his head revealing something raw beneath the stoic surface. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Some folks deserve protection before introductions." The wagon dipped into the shadow of the pines, and Jonah guided the mare off the trail entirely, weaving through the underbrush, wheels bumping softly over fallen needles. Their tracks disappeared quickly, swallowed by the forest floor. Jonah stopped in a patch of dappled sunlight. "We walk from here," he said. "Riders will miss this turn if they're focused on tracks out in the open." Miriam's legs trembled as he helped her down, and she clung to him instinctively when a sharp kick from the baby jolted her balance. Jonah steadied her, one arm circling her waist until she found her footing. "Breathe," he murmured, "nice and even." But the peace didn't last. The distant thunder of hooves rolled across the prairie, leaking through the trees like a warning drum. Miriam's pulse hammered. "Jonah," he turned toward the sound, his hand drifting to the revolver holstered low on his thigh. "They're closer than I hoped." He guided her deeper into the forest, each stride purposeful. "We'll lose 'em before dark," he promised. "You're safe with me." But as the shadows thickened and the hoofbeats grew louder, both of them understood the truth. Safety wasn't something you claimed once. You had to keep earning it, step by fleeing step. The forest swallowed the noise of the prairie behind them, replacing hoofbeats with the hush of pine needles and the soft groan of branches shifting under the afternoon sun. Jonah guided Miriam through the narrow weave of trees, slowing his stride so her breathing could catch up, though the tension in his shoulders showed he wanted nothing more than to move faster. The air felt cooler here, trapped beneath the towering pines, and the filtered light painted Miriam's face in soft gold that barely hid her exhaustion. When her steps faltered for the third time, Jonah stopped immediately. "Sit," he said gently, helping her lower herself onto a fallen log cushioned by moss. She tried to protest. "Jonah, we can't stop. They were too close. They'll—" He crouched in front of her, placing a hand on her knee, not forceful, but steady. "We can run again in a minute, Nira," he said. "But you're shaken hard enough to fall over, and that child you're carrying deserves a breath." Her throat tightened at the kindness threaded through his voice. The world had taught her to expect impatience, disgust, or suspicion, not consideration. She wrapped her arms around her belly, drawing slow breaths as Jonah unbuckled the canteen from his belt and pressed it into her hands. "Drink," he said. She sipped, the cool water easing the dryness in her throat. Jonah watched her carefully, eyes searching her face for signs of dizziness or pain. "You feeling cramps?" he asked quietly. "Any sharp pulling?" She shook her head. "Just tired. Scared." Jonah nodded once, as if he understood both better than she knew. Then he rose, scanning the forest edge with practiced precision. Sunlight flickered through the branches, brushing over the revolver at his hip. "We're safe for the moment," he murmured, lowering himself to sit beside her on the log, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his arm, but not so close that she ever felt trapped. Miriam swallowed the last sip of water and handed him the canteen with trembling fingers. "I'm not used to someone stopping for me," she admitted, eyes fixed on the pine needles at her feet. "Thomas, my husband, he was a good man, but work always came first. And after him, no one's ever slowed down long enough to see me." Jonah's jaw flexed slightly, as though the thought of her being overlooked struck a personal chord. "You deserve better than hurry and harsh words," he said quietly. "A woman carrying life shouldn't have to beg for dignity." She blinked, surprised by how easily his words cracked the shell around her chest. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "You don't know what I've done or failed to do. You don't know the mistakes I made with Thomas, with Harold, with everything." Jonah turned toward her, his voice dropping lower, softer. "I don't need to know every sorrow you've carried," he said. "I can see the weight plain enough." Her breath caught, not from fear this time, but from the unfamiliar comfort of being seen without judgment. For a moment, the forest seemed to lean closer, listening. Jonah reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it to reveal half a loaf of dense brown bread, a wedge of cheese, and a strip of dried meat. "Eat," he urged, placing the food in her hands. Miriam's fingers hovered hesitantly before she took a small bite. The bread was rough and salty, the cheese sharp, but it grounded her instantly, settling her nerves like warm hands pressed to cold skin. "Thank you," she murmured between bites. "I haven't eaten since last night. Harold said I didn't work enough to earn more." Jonah exhaled sharply, the closest thing to anger he'd allowed to show. "Work enough?" he repeated, voice tight. "You're carrying a child and still standing. That's work enough for 10 men. Fresh tears blurred her vision, but she wiped them quickly. Jonah brushed a crumb from her cheek with the back of one knuckle, hesitant but tender. "You're doing just fine," he murmured. "And you're not alone anymore." Before she could respond, a faint crack echoed deeper in the woods, far away but not far enough. Jonah's head snapped toward the sound. He rose swiftly, his hand drifting once more to the revolver. "Rest's over," he said softly, offering her his hand. "You ready?" Miriam slid her fingers into his, and though fear still fluttered in her chest, there was something steadier beneath it now, something born of mercy, of the simple act of being fed and treated as if her life mattered. "I'm ready," she whispered, and Jonah helped her to her feet, guiding her deeper into the forest, where shadows and hope braided together, promising safety that had been denied her for far too long. Jonah led Miriam deeper through the pines, until the ground sloped upward, the trees thinning into a steep ridge where sunlight stretched wide and bright across the open sky. The air shifted, no longer muffled by branches but sharpened by altitude, and the widow's breaths came faster as they climbed, Jonah slowing just enough to keep her balanced. When they reached the crest, the world spilled open beneath them, rolling prairie, a thin snake of creek, and far to the south, 3 riders weaving through brush like wolves catching scent. Miriam gripped Jonah's sleeve, her voice a thin thread. "They're still following." "They won't get this far without seeing trouble first," Jonah said, scanning the ridge for anything they could use. The ridge narrowed into a natural choke point, a place where the path tightened between 2 jutting stone outcrops. Wildflowers grew in the cracks, trembling in the breeze, but beneath their softness lay the perfect advantage, a point where 1 man could stop 3 if he stood at the right angle. Jonah exhaled once, steady and deliberate. "This is where we make 'em turn back." Miriam's eyes widened. "Jonah, no. They'll shoot you. Harold doesn't care about law or witnesses." "He won't shoot," Jonah said calmly. "Men like him only pull guns when they already won. He ain't won today." She clutched his arm harder, panic rising fast. "Please, Jonah, let's run instead. I can keep going, I promise." He touched her cheek lightly, brushing away a streak of sweat with the back of his knuckle. "You've run enough for 10 lifetimes," he said, "and you ain't running anymore." Before she could speak, he guided her into the cleft between the rocks, where shade pooled cool and still. "Stay here. Sit if you need to. You'll be behind me the whole time." Miriam's breath shook as she lowered herself onto a flat stone, pulling her shawl around her belly instinctively. She stared at Jonah's back, broad, steady, unmoving, as he stepped into the narrowing of the ridge. Wind whipped at his coat, carrying the scent of pine and dust. Then, faint but rising, came the rumble of hooves. Harold's voice followed, carried thin on the wind. "Spread out. She can't have gotten far." Jonah planted his boots shoulder-width apart, revolver holstered but thumb resting just above it, not threatening, just ready. He waited until the first horse crested the lower ridge, Harold's sweaty face twisting with triumph as he spotted the familiar shape of the shawl peeking from the rocks. "There," Harold barked. "Move aside, cowboy. She's coming with us." Jonah didn't move. "She's not leaving with a man who chases widows like game." Harold yanked the reins, stopping his horse so abruptly the animal snorted and tossed its head. "You think she didn't tell me where she was running? She owes me rent, and I'm taking her back." "A debt you invented," Jonah replied coldly. The other 2 riders flanked Harold, their hands twitching near their belts, not because they wanted to fight, Miriam realized, but because they were terrified of being the first to step forward. "Move!" Harold snarled. "She's mine!" Jonah took 1 step forward, planting himself solidly at the narrowest part of the ridge, his silhouette framed by endless sky. "Say that again," he murmured. Harold's bravado flickered. "I said, She's— Jonah's voice cut through the air like a blade. A woman carrying a child ain't property, and she sure as hell ain't yours. Harold raised his hand to order the men forward. But Jonah drew. Not firing, not raising the barrel, just drawing fast enough that all three men flinched backward in the same breath. "Nobody's touching her," Jonah said, voice low but loud enough to echo off the rocks. "You ain't taking her down that ridge. You ain't laying a hand on her belly or her clothes or even her shadow." Harold's face crumpled between fury and fear. "You're making a mistake, cowboy." Jonah didn't blink. "Already made my choice." The wind stilled for one long moment. Then one of Harold's men pulled his horse back, muttering, "This ain't worth it." The second followed. Harold stared at them, stunned, then swung his gaze back to Jonah, hatred burning, but no courage left behind it. When he finally yanked his reins and turned downhill, it wasn't a retreat. It was a defeat. Jonah waited until the riders disappeared into the trees before lowering his revolver, exhaling slow as the tension drained from his shoulders. Behind him, Miriam covered her mouth with both hands, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, not from fear this time, but from the sight of someone choosing her as worth fighting for. And when Jonah turned around, his eyes softened the moment he saw her. "Told you," he murmured, offering his hand. "You don't run anymore." They descended the ridge slowly, Jonah keeping one steadying hand near Miriam's back, as the trail widened into a gentle slope that led toward a quiet clearing bordered by tall grass and wind-carved stones. The sun hung warm above them, its light softening the hard edges of the moment they had just survived, but Miriam's legs still trembled from everything: the climb, the fear, the way Jonah had stood in front of her like a wall no man could break. At the bottom of the slope, the land opened into a circle of prairie framed by scattered boulders that rose like natural sentries, and Miriam realized Jonah had stopped not by accident, but intention. This place felt strangely still, almost sacred in its silence. She eased onto a flat rock while Jonah checked the horizon again, his eyes narrowing toward the tree line where Harold had disappeared minutes earlier. When he was satisfied, no one followed. He came back to her, kneeling one knee in the grass, hat pushed back so she could see his whole face, stern, yes, but softened by a new resolve that hadn't been there before the ridge. "Miriam," he said gently, using her name for the first time in a way that felt deliberate, grounded. Her breath caught at the sound of it, spoken not like a burden or accusation, but like something he intended to protect. "You're safe here for a moment," he continued, "long enough to settle what comes next." She twisted the edge of her shawl in her fingers, throat tightening. "Jonah, what you did up there, standing against them, that's going to make Harold furious. He'll go back to town, tell lies, stir men up." Jonah nodded once, slow and certain. "He will," he said, "and if he returns, he won't come alone." Her heart lurched. "So what do we do?" A gust of wind stirred the prairie grass, bending the tall stalks in ripples that sounded almost like breath. Jonah didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, creased, worn, and smudged with dirt. He held it out to her. "This belonged to you." Miriam hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his. When she opened it, her stomach dropped. It was the paper Harold claimed she signed, a crooked scrawled agreement stating she owed him months of labor value, with no date, no seal, nothing legal about it at all. She stared at it, tears rising out of shock and humiliation. This is what he chased me for," she whispered. Jonah nodded. "Found it near the creek when we left the wagon. Must have fallen from your bag." She looked up at him, voice breaking. "He was going to drag me back with this." Jonah didn't take the paper back. Instead, he stood, stepped into the center of the clearing, and raised the paper high enough for the wind to catch it. "Miriam Larson," he said, not loudly, but with a firmness that wrapped her name in something she'd forgotten could exist. "This paper ain't law. It ain't truth. It ain't worth the dirt it fell on." Miriam's breath trembled, watching as the breeze tugged at the corner. Jonah's eyes met hers, steady as bedrock. "And I'm putting an end to the lie right now. Not for me. For you." He held the paper out once more, but this time toward the sun, and then, with a flick of his wrist, he tore it cleanly in half, The sound was small, insignificant compared to the storm she'd lived through, yet something inside her broke open, the pressure in her chest finally releasing as he let the pieces scatter across the grass like leaves. When they settled, Jonah placed his hand on his chest and turned slightly so his voice carried across the clearing as though offering witness. "Hear me clear," he said. "This woman, Miriam, is under my protection." The words struck her like a pulse. Not claimed as property, not owned, protected. The difference sank, deep, warm, and unfamiliar. He stepped closer, offering her his hand once more, but only when she nodded did he help her to her feet, guiding her gently into the golden circle of light. "From this moment," Jonah murmured, "no man speaks for you but you." Miriam lifted her chin, a flicker of courage moving through her chest as she whispered, "Thank you for saying my name like it matters." Jonah's eyes softened. "It does," he said, "more than you know." And as the torn scraps of Harold's lie shimmered in the breeze, Miriam felt for the first time in months that her name, her life, was becoming her own again. Jonah guided Miriam toward the line of pines that bordered the clearing, keeping her close to his side as the long shadows of late afternoon stretched across the grass like dark fingers reaching for what little piece they'd built. The warmth of the sun softened as clouds drifted in, turning the sky a pale silver that made the air feel tighter, the moment heavier. Miriam walked slowly, one hand on her belly, the other clutching Jonah's sleeve for balance. Not fear now, just the fragile steadiness of a woman who had spent too long bracing for blows she didn't deserve. They reached the first trees when Jonah stopped suddenly, listening, head tilted in that instinctive way that meant danger wasn't behind them anymore. It was ahead. Miriam froze too, her breath catching. Through the pines came the crunch of boots, not hurried, not many, just one man moving with the uneasy confidence of someone who believed he still had power. Harold stepped into view, leaning against a dead pine trunk as though he'd been waiting. His shirt was rumpled, sweat darkened, and one of his men's horses trailed behind him, reins dragging like Harold had yanked it all the way here without care. His eyes slid to Miriam first, hungry, accusing, bitter, and then to Jonah with a bitterness that grew sharper by the second. "Thought you'd outrun me," Harold drawled, pushing off the tree as if the world owed him this moment. "I told you it wasn't over." Jonah didn't reach for his gun. He didn't even shift his stance. He simply placed himself half a step in front of Miriam, blocking Harold's view of her belly entirely. "You came alone," Jonah said quietly. "Bad choice." Harold scoffed. "My men won't cross that ridge again. Said you weren't worth dying over." He spat at the ground. "But I don't need them. I just need her to come back. She owes me." Miriam flinched at the familiar poison in his voice. "I owe you nothing," she whispered, but Harold talked over her. "I fed you all winter," he snarled, "let you stay on my land. Your husband dies in a fire, and suddenly you think you can just walk out on responsibility?" Jonah's jaw tightened. "You demanded payment she never agreed to," he said. "You chased a pregnant widow through town. She collapsed because of you." Harold's face twisted. "She's lying. She always lies when men stop pitying her." Miriam's breath hitched. Jonah took one slow step forward, and suddenly Harold wasn't smirking anymore. He was shrinking. "You will watch your mouth," Jonah murmured, "and you will listen for once in your miserable life." The wind stirred the pine needles, making a sound like 1,000 whispers. Harold tried to regain footing, grasping at anger. "She signed a paper." "I tore that paper in half," Jonah said. "It wasn't law. It wasn't truth. It was you trying to trap a woman who trusted the wrong man." Harold's face drained of color. "You had no right." "I had every right," Jonah cut in, "because I don't stand by while cowards prey on the vulnerable." Harold took a stumbling step backward, voice cracking as he tried to salvage the last shreds of authority. "You think people will believe her over me? I got half the town who'll take my word." Miriam stepped out from behind Jonah then, not all the way, just enough to be seen. Her voice trembled, but her words were steady. "I don't need town approval," she said softly. "I just need you gone." Harold's expression twisted. "You ungrateful little—" Jonah moved so fast Harold didn't finish the sentence. He grabbed Harold's shirt front in one fist and slammed him back against the pine trunk, not hard enough to break him, but hard enough to break the illusion that Harold had any power left. "You're done," Jonah said, his voice low, dangerous, final. "She won't run anymore. Not from you, not from anyone." Harold's breath shook, his bravado cracking down the middle. "If you hit me—" "I'm not hitting you," Jonah said. "I'm warning you." He let go, letting Harold collapse forward onto his own feet. "Ride home, or ride out of the county, I don't care which. But if you come near Miriam again, if you even breathe her name in anger, you'll answer to me." Harold staggered backward, fear finally overtaking pride. He didn't argue this time, didn't spit, didn't threaten. He simply swung onto the stolen horse and rode off, fast, desperate, not once looking back. When he disappeared, Jonah turned to Miriam, his expression softening instantly. "It's over," he murmured. Miriam shook her head, then nodded, then whispered, voice cracking under the weight of relief. "For the first time, I believe you." And together they stepped deeper into the pines, leaving Harold and every lie he'd ever told behind them in the dust. Evening settled soft across the valley as Jonah guided Miriam along a winding trail that dipped into a wide meadow brushed with tall golden grass, each blade swaying in the gentle wind like a welcome. The sky glowed with the last warm colors of the day, strokes of pink and pale orange stretching over the horizon. Miriam leaned on Jonah's arm as they walked, her legs trembling, not from fear anymore, but from the exhaustion of safety finally catching up to her. The trail curved one last time, and there, tucked against the rise of a small hill, stood a cabin made of weathered pine logs, its windows glowing faintly with the reflection of the sunset, smoke curling from the chimney in slow, lazy puffs. A small porch stretched across the front, sturdy and simple, with 2 wooden chairs carved by hand. It looked lived in, dependable, honest. Jonah hesitated for only a breath before speaking. "My place," he said quietly, almost shyly despite the strength he'd shown all day. "Ain't much, but it's warm, and there's food, and no Harold or anyone who listens to him." Miriam stared, her hand drifting to her belly as a soft tremor of emotion moved through her. "You brought me home," she whispered. Jonah dipped his head, eyes warm. "Only if you want it to be that," he said. "You can rest here tonight, no questions. Tomorrow, whatever path you choose, I'll help you walk it." She swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the gentleness in his voice, the patience in his stance. When they stepped onto the porch, the boards creaked softly beneath their boots. Jonah opened the door, revealing a small but inviting space, a stone fireplace with a low-burning fire, a braided rug, shelves lined with jars, a sturdy table, and a small bed near the wall, fresh blankets folded at its foot. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the nearest chair. "I'll fix you something." But when she lowered herself into the seat, she covered her face with both hands, breath shaking, not from fear, but from release. Jonah knelt in front of her, concern flickering across his features. "Miriam?" She lifted her head, tears shimmering down her cheeks. I didn't think kindness like this still existed," she whispered. "Not for women like me. Not for women carrying too much grief and not enough hope." Jonah's gaze softened like dusk settling on water. "Hope don't measure a woman," he said. "How she keeps going, that's what counts." She reached for his hand, squeezing it with trembling fingers. "Why are you helping me like this?" He took a slow breath. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it," he said. "And I swore if I ever saw someone standing where I stood, tired, scared, hurt, I'd be the one who didn't walk away." The room felt warmer for a moment, the fire snapping gently as if in approval. Jonah rose, fetched bread, warmed broth, and poured her water with hands steady and patient. She ate slowly, tears falling quietly, but without shame now. When she finished, he placed a blanket around her shoulders, careful not to startle her. "You saved me," she whispered. Jonah shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just made sure you didn't fall alone." Outside, the last light faded, stars beginning to scatter across the sky like silver seeds. Inside, the fire's glow wrapped the room in a soft embrace. Miriam looked toward the small bed, then toward Jonah's steady presence, and something inside her, worn for months, maybe years, unclenched. "Jonah," she said softly, "I don't want to leave tomorrow." His breath hitched just slightly before he stepped closer. "Then don't," he whispered. She rested her hand atop his, the warmth of his skin grounding her in a way nothing else had. For the first time in months, she wasn't running, wasn't hiding, wasn't collapsing under someone's cruelty. She was choosing, and she was choosing safety, choosing home, choosing him. Miriam drew in a shaky breath. "If you were in my place," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady in spirit, "what would you choose?" Jonah held her gaze, eyes deep and warm. "The place where someone sees me as worth saving," he murmured. "And I'm hoping you see that here." As the fire crackled softly behind them and the night settled around the little cabin, Miriam let the truth wash over her. She had found more than shelter. She had found a place where her name, her child, and her weary heart were finally unquestionably safe. If you were in her place, what would you choose?